Tis a blustery night in New Jersey, and the police are watching the street outside the city, searching for a lawbreaker. They stop a speeding truck and a cop moves toward the driver to request an ID, which the driver doesn't have. Different police really take a look at the rear of the truck and are stunned to track down an enormous gathering of canines. Minutes after the fact, Specialist Evelyn shows up at the police headquarters to assess the driver and settle on prison time, or on the other hand, a psychological foundation. At the point when she enters the cell, she tracks down the driver in a wheelchair and notification a new injury. The individual pivots furthermore. Evelyn learns he's a cross-dresser named Doug, who makes sense of the canines in the truck were his kids. Then Evelyn persuades him to share his story. Doug experienced childhood in a strict redneck family. His dad, Mike, raised canines for battling, and he would try and starve the canines a couple of days before each fight to make them more forceful. Mike additionally utilized any reason to hit his significant other and Doug, particularly assuming that they attempted to take care of the canines. Anyway, he was attached to his more seasoned child Richie on the grounds that he took after him. The canines were forceful during the battles, however they adored Doug, who might rest close to the enclosure to converse with them and pet them, once in a while sneaking nourishment for them. Tragically, one day Richie discovered him in the act and told Mike, who defied Doug during lunch. Doug conceded he enjoyed canines better than his own family, so an enraged Mike hauled him out and tossed him in the enclosure with the canines, who quickly drew nearer to him to snuggle him and solace him. From that point on, Doug carried on with his life in the enclosure, including during the freezing winter, eating any pieces his father would toss him. At some point, his mother presented to him a few jars and advised him to cover them to conceal them. Then, at that point, she declared she was taking off on the grounds that she was pregnant and she needed to give the child a superior life. Doug lets Evelyn know that he doesn't dislike her for it. In a little while, Richie set up a sign on the enclosure that said, "For the sake of God," saying his mother leaving was Doug's shortcoming. Anyway, Doug grinned in light of the fact that he saw the sign in reverse and God spelled canine. After Evelyn leaves for the afternoon, a flashback uncovers what occurred before Doug's capture. A man named Juan entered a neglected school building and found a Doberman monitoring the hall. He requested the dogman, and an entryway opened to Doug's mystery quarters, which looked very pleasant thinking about the sorry condition of the structure. It was Juan who introduced every one of the cameras a couple months prior. Presently, he gave Doug a pup found by Martha, an old woman responsible for the neighborhood laundromat who did Doug's clothing. He made sense of that a hoodlum known as the Killer had been taking cash from neighborhood organizations consistently, yet Martha couldn't pay him any longer, and she had to sell some adored family effects. Doug told him not to stress since he would deal with it. In a little while, Douglas spruced up as a widow and looked out for the road close to the club where hoodlums hung out. He sent a little canine inside with a telephone in its mouth, and the canine gave the telephone to the Killer just before it rang. The criminal got the call as a greater canine additionally entered the club and put its mouth on the Killer's crotch, making him shout in torment. Doug told the person not to move or the canine would make super durable harm. Then he made sense of he maintained that the Killer should let Martha be or the canine would partake in a feast brimming with nuts. The Killer consented to the arrangement, and when the canines ran out of the bar, he sent his men after them. In the present, morning comes and Evelyn visits Doug's home while the police are gathering proof. There are bodies and blood out of control, also the slug openings. In the wake of getting a couple of things, Evelyn gets back to the station, where Doug has proactively cleaned up and changed. He's thankful to her for bringing his things and proceeds with his story. Little Doug needed to live in the enclosure for quite a long time, and he got his schooling from magazines he tracked down taking cover behind a board, most likely left by his mom. On one occasion, one of the canines got pregnant, so Doug concealed the pups, away from his family's eyes. Sadly, Richie again saw him and told his father, who quickly came out furnished and prepared to fare thee well of the pups. Doug promptly hooked on the enclosure entryway and began hollering at Mike while the canines yapped and snarled along. Enraged, Mike shot Doug through the entryway and made him fall. The slug hit his hand and caused him to lose a finger, then it kicked back and hit Doug in his spine. Stressed this could grow into real demise, Richie took Mike inside in the wake of dropping a hanky for Doug. Incapable to move much, Doug put the hanky around his draining hand and the finger inside a little pack. Then, at that point, he went after a magazine and showed his canine an image of a squad car as he gave it the sack with the finger, advising the canine to leave through the opening left by the shot and view as the cops. The canine took off with the pack in its mouth and crossed the town until it found a squad car, on which it sat until the police paid thoughtfulness regarding it. Before long, a lot of officials encompassed Doug's home and raged in, finding the unfortunate kid in the enclosure and Richie gripping to Mike in dread inside. A rescue vehicle immediately removed Doug. However, the specialist didn't eliminate the projectile. In the present, Doug makes sense of for Evelyn that with the leg supports he can walk somewhat, barely enough to do things like getting into bed. He can likewise stand, however, just for a couple of moments. The specialist didn't eliminate the projectile since, supposing that they move things around that area, they might leave him totally paraplegic, which is likewise a risk each time Doug stands up. Mike was given a sentence of 20 years, yet he self-erased following 14 days. Richie was given 12 years and was delivered after 8 for good way of behaving. On the day that he emerged, a couple of canines were hanging tight for him outside the jail and begun to follow him. As Richie strolled through town, an ever-increasing number of canines joined the initial ones until Richie at last saw them. He attempted to get away from through a rear entryway, yet the canines hopped on him and destroyed him to death. After he was set free from the emergency clinic, Doug was shipped off a shelter. However, he couldn't make companions. Different children were continuously playing outside, so he remained in his wheelchair in the library. What's more, read a ton. The main individual that got to know him was Salma, Doug's sole love. She was a young lady who helped around the shelter and adored Shakespeare. Since she heard Doug jumped at the chance to peruse as well, she acquainted him with all her #1 books and, surprisingly, persuaded him to do little plays for different children. The vast majority of their props were modest or hand-tailored, yet they put heaps of heart and energy into their acting, so different kids adored it. Doug had bunches of tomfoolery sprucing up and truly appreciated Salma, showing him how to put on cosmetics since she said it assisted him with being whoever he needed to be. Salma was brilliant, imaginative, and had a novel perspective on the world that made Doug immediately go gaga for her. Tragically, one day she passed on the halfway house to seek after a lifelong in acting, and through the next years, Doug would gather each news story he saw about her plays, cautiously adding them to his scrapbook. Ultimately, Doug turned into a grown-up and gone to school through web-based courses, earning an unhitched male's college education in organic sciences prior to finding a new line of work at a canine haven. When Salma at last came to Broadway, Doug went to see her play and attempted to move toward the stage. Yet everybody was standing up and he proved unable to access it. Fortunately, he was permitted behind the stage, and Salma promptly remembered him. She was extremely glad to see him and truly appreciated his blossoms. However, she got significantly more energized when he gifted her the scrapbook. Salma was complimented to such an extent that she said thanks to him with a kiss, making his expectations go up. Doug was going to admit his sentiments when out of nowhere the chief came in and commended the scrapbook too. Doug was crushed to hear Salma was hitched to him, and they were at that point anticipating a child. Grief-stricken, Doug praised them and returned to the safe house, where he rose up to have the option to holler and stir things up around town to manage his anger. The canines woofed at him, and at the point when he fell on the floor, one canine battled with the hook until it figured out how to open the enclosure, making every one of the canines emerge and nestle Doug to comfort him. A short time later, Doug trimmed his hair as an image of giving up. In a little while, 2 men from the public authority appeared to illuminate him that they were shutting everything down cover under the reason of financial plan cuts. Doug called attention to that the financial plan was cut consistently since he accepted the position. He actually kept the sanctuary up on the grounds that he lived off gifts, so the main city financing he had was the actual structure. Feeling got, the men conceded that the site was being offered to a designer to create a gain. Douglas had until Monday to move out, and the canines would ideally be shipped off different safe houses. Anyway, when Monday came, the specialists found the structure void in light of the fact that Doug had taken off with the canines. That was when Doug moved into the neglected school building, where he invested energy perusing to his pup family. He before long began to search for a task. However, every spot would turn him down in light of his wheelchair. One evening, Doug went to a club that was searching for a barman and showed up with perfect timing to watch the cross-dressers practice, quickly going gaga for their ensembles and their specialty. The proprietor let Doug know that he previously recruited somebody for the bar, yet Doug reported he needed to act all things being equal, sharing his experience. The man brought up individuals wouldn't be keen on an exhibition done in a wheelchair, so Doug got off the seat and made sense if he could represent an entire melody. The sovereigns were extremely dazzled and thought that he is adorable, so they persuaded the proprietor to allow Doug an opportunity. The next Friday, the sovereigns assisted Douglas with getting garments, cosmetics, and a hairpiece for his presentation. Needing to establish a decent connection, he eliminated his leg supports and requested that his new companions be prepared to get him when he was finished. The sovereigns assisted him with arriving at the stage, and he held up in the background, which opened when he was presented as Edith Piaf. Doug began singing in French while doing slight developments with his hands, and both people in general and his associates were charmed by his voice. Everybody could hear the crude feeling in the verses, and by, everybody applauded and supported Doug, needing more. The shades shut, and the other sovereigns hurried to get Doug just before he fell. From that point on, Doug was permitted to act in the club each Friday night. Clearly, this didn't pay enough to live, so Doug began a help that coordinated desolate individuals with the right canine for organization and security. He additionally gave them additional assistance assuming that they required it, suggesting criminal operations like how he managed the killer. One day while he was cooking, the canines would present to him any fixing he wanted from the storeroom, and this caused Doug to understand this could be utilized to do what he called fair reallocation of abundance. His littlest canine would slip inside rich individuals' homes through windows or roof incubates that were left open due to their little size. Then, at that point, the canine would open a greater entry so the wide range of various canines could come in as well. Together, they would take all the adornments they could convey, and no one at any point thought creatures were making it happen. Things worked out positively for some time until one day, a rich woman called protection specialist Ackerman, who thought she was attempting to commit protection misrepresentation. Probably every window and entryway in her home had been locked with the exception of a minuscule washroom window. Also, her canines didn't bark. Anyway, the woman gave him the security camera tapes, and when Ackerman began to watch them, he saw a canine running out with something in its mouth. It looked insane. However, at that point, he recalled the other strange cases from the most recent couple of months and actually looked at different accounts also. He was stunned to find that similar canines were dependably on the screen, and they had been excused as irregular wanderers by different specialists. In one specific recording, Ackerman viewed a person imagining as a gatekeeper sitting tight for the canines with a truck. He examined the tag and tracked down Doug's profile, ultimately finding he was working at the club. One Friday night, Ackerman went to Doug's presentation and to his shock, he was wearing one of the taken neckbands. After the show, Ackerman went to the changing area with a Blossom, professing to be Doug's fan. He asked him out for supper. However, Doug turned him down since he needed to return home to take care of his children. At the point when Doug left the bar, Ackerman discreetly followed him. As he entered the old structure with a weapon, the canines cautioned Doug, who promptly requested that they stow away. Ackerman found the Doberman watching the hallway and thought about shooting. Yet at that point, Doug opened the entryway and told him the gems was in the safe. When he had the container, Ackerman sat down to check everything was in there, and Doug utilized the opportunity to arrange his canines to kill him. Now that a large portion of his life has been covered, Doug shares why he got captured. The night after Doug helped Martha, the killer and his posse found the neglected structure since they beat up Juan until he talked. When they were certain they were at the perfect spot, they killed Juan with a shot. The sound cautioned Doug of their presence, and he advised the canines to get ready for battle, while he snatched a weapon from his assortment. The killer overlooked the Doberman and began to shoot the metal way without much of any result while Doug gotten away from through a limited secret passageway. At that point, a little canine ran by the passageway and a hoodlum followed him into an opening, just for the greater canines to drag him in and kill him. Then the pack split and began to follow the various canines that continued to top into the passageway. A fellow followed a canine into a restroom with a wet floor, and the canine delivered a link to shock him. Another person followed a chihuahua into a storage space, and when he drew sufficiently near, Doug shot him through the wall. A man went into some unacceptable room and got himself encircled by enormous canines that promptly battered him to death. While pursuing a little canine, one more person fell inside a secret pit, and when his companion attempted to help him, the canine pushed him down too. Then Doug came over and shot them both. In the hall, a criminal ventured on a snare and was passed on swinging from the roof for a canine to get. Close by, one more hoodlum likewise fell in a snare and got destroyed too. The killer began to get apprehensive and requested that his men present to him a superior weapon. At that point, Doug started shooting through the wall, cutting down a couple of men. At the point when the killer gave back, a shot hurt Doug's back before he figured out how to duck. A frantic Doug hauled his body through the floor and took the limited passage to get back to his quarters, while the killer utilized the greater weapon to at last open the entryway. He came inside and attempted to shoot Doug, just to find he ran out of shots, and the canines utilized the opportunity to kill him as well. A while later, Doug and his canines got away from in a truck, and that was the point at which the police got them. While Doug held up in the squad car, he offered the canines a hint and they quickly took off. In the present, Evelyn tells Doug she's adequately heard and leaves. Then, at that point, Doug smokes close to the window and grins when he hears a canine cry. It turns out his canine has been holding up outside, and at the cry, all the different canines come to the area as well. While Doug spruces up pleasantly with the things Evelyn presented to him, the canines enter the station and alarm the front watchman into dropping. Then, at that point, an extremely thin canine takes the keys and crosses the bars to drop the keys by Doug's entryway. Subsequently, Doug escapes and abandons, still up in the air, to stroll to the congregation across the road. He requests that God condemn, and afterward he falls on the ground as he takes his final gasp. Before long, the entirety of his canines encompass him, and each canine around likewise comes to bid farewell. In the interim, the Doberman goes to Evelyn's home to safeguard her from her fierce ex.